It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Willie James Jennings. Dr. Jennings has a distinguished academic background. He's got his PhD from Duke. He's currently a professor of systematic theology and Africana studies at Yale University Divinity School. He is a person that has written profoundly and important works. And the one for which he was awarded the Grawemeyer Award was a book on Christian imagination, theology, and the origins of race. That was, in one sense, a troubling and disturbing book for many of us about the deep connections between Christianity and racism and race as we know it, but also a word of encouragement that Christianity might have a different future in healing some of these divisions. And so we are extremely grateful, Dr. Jennings, to have you with us. We look forward to your presentation, and we look forward to a lively dialogue that follows us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennings.
Good morning. To Reverend Dr. President Jenkins, to the absolutely brilliant director of the Office of Black Church Studies here, the Reverend Dr. Felicia LaBoy, to my wonderful dear friend, Dr. Shannon Craig-O'Snell, and to all the fabulous colleagues at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, to all the pastors present, to dear friends who I've known for many years, the Reverend Joe Small and his wonderful bride. I am thrilled to be back at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, back in Louisville, especially when it's still warm outside. So I want to thank you all for the timing of this event. It is a great honor and a great joy for me to be here again at the seminary in association with the Grawemeyer Award winners in religion. And such a great honor for me to be here with my dear sister and all the others who have been a part of this program. This has been absolutely exciting. Last night was wonderful. I could have listened to that dear brother for hours. And my sister who preached, thank God that you're a Baptist. I'm so thankful. Thank God she's a Baptist. I'm just so pleased to be a Baptist when I hear a Baptist who can preach like that. I've recently made a move from Duke University Divinity School to Yale University Divinity School, and please do keep me and my family in your prayers. I am married to a stunning woman. She's from the island of Bermuda, and we've been living in the warm South, enjoying the sun of the South, and we're getting ready to move to New Haven, Connecticut. And pray that she'll love me again. Pray that she'll love me again. And I've promised her that the Lord will be with us, and that if she wants, she can buy boots for every day of the week, coats. But we are thankful. We're thankful for the adventure that God has for us as we make our move. My life has been changed significantly since winning the award. But what has not changed is my commitment to the work that shapes my career and scholarship. I am a theologian, deeply committed, deeply concerned with the future of Christianity in the world, and especially in the racial West and all those areas of the world touched by its legacies, as well as those parts of the world that have their own unique forms of racial reasoning and cultural xenophobia. I have been greatly concerned, especially with the effects of racial reasoning on the peoples of the African diaspora, but also on the earth, lands, plants, animals, and on how habitation is constructed and constrained by race. We Christians, we confess belief in creation and of a God who creates, not out of necessity, but out of love. That belief, however, is yet to do the real work of shaping how we see the world and understand the form of life that ought to characterize people who believe in a God who creates and has, through Jesus Christ, bound creaturely life to the divine life. We continue to live in the midst of an upheaval that we have never been able to comprehend fully or begin to address in any substantive way, and that is the devastating effects of private property and the spatial distribution of goods and services calibrated along racial lines. As Carl Nightingale notes in his epic text, Segregation, A Global History of Divided Cities, segregation is an ancient strategy for constructing the world the way the rich and the powerful wish the world to be. But since the advent of colonialism, segregation has been more than a crucial strategy of control, containment, and exploitation. It has also been an important tool to help enact genocide. Segregation is always the precursor to genocide. And not just genocide, but genocide bound to the concealment and ignorance generated by sequestered spaces. We understand, everybody in this room understands the horrors of genocide and violence, but we rarely see the connection of such matters to what I call racialized geography. That our geography and our sense of place has been racialized functions unconsciously in our thinking. We could call it the geographic unconscious, playing off of philosopher and literary theorist Frederick Jameson's famous book on the political unconscious. And similar to Jameson's account of the political unconscious, the geographic unconscious means that segregated spaces function in us far more deeply than we realize or regularly take into account. We narrate our spaces with the distribution and arrangement of racialized bodies, always as an economic and emotional backdrop. Our thinking about the places we live and work, the places in which we learn and play, the places that are built up or torn down, anticipates patterns of movement of racialized bodies. Our geographic senses are haunted by racial anxiety. Racial calculations and spatial calculations have always flowed together. They've always flowed together in the history of the colonial West, and yet we yet live in the powerful undertow of that history. And what haunts me is the way Christianity has been and continues to be complicit with and subject to this undertow. Christian faith and life continues to be driven by the geographic winds created by land developers, city planners, civil engineers, real estate agents, city government officials, and architects. We are, however, not simply passive spectators to the constant geographic turnings of contemporary life. We have performed our faith right on top of those developments, often presenting them as natural and normal ways of forming life and living in the world. When in fact, they have never been natural or normal. The way space is divided is not normal, sisters and brothers. And we have made it natural and normal. One powerful example of this in the United States has been the history and phenomena of sundown towns. Let me see a hands of how many of you know what a sundown town is. That's about right. About a third of people know what a sundown town is. Sundown towns were towns all across the U.S. I want to make sure you hear this. All across the U.S. Not particularly in the South. All across the U.S. that from the beginning of the 1890s through the 1940s purposely removed and kept out African Americans, sometimes Jews, sometimes Asians, from their towns. These were towns that aggressively, that's the word I want to underscore, aggressively sought to construct themselves as all-white communities. These towns, many of them filled with deeply committed Christians. Did you hear what I just said? Filled with deeply committed Christians, constructed a geographic whiteness. Did you think of those two words together? A geographic whiteness that permeated the earth, the land, and all their surroundings. A geographic whiteness that you could feel, was palpable. Geographic whiteness. Now, of course, the question, why would they do that? Why would they do that? We do not have to go back in time to understand the rationale there. We can come to our present moment and understand their logic, because the powerful inertia of the sundown town lives with us to this very moment. Last year, I was lecturing at Howard Payne University in Brownwood, Texas. Howard Payne is a wonderful small liberal arts institution. And those of you from Texas know this. The easiest way to get to Howard Payne is to fly into Austin, Texas, and then drive for 2 hours to the campus. So that's what I did. I flew into Austin, Texas, and someone came to Austin, gathered me, and drove me to the school. And the drive to Brownwood, Texas, is an amazing drive. The Texas landscape has a stark beauty almost unmatched anywhere else, where the skyline and the beautiful earth meet always in front of you on the horizon. And as you're driving in Texas, heading from Austin to Brownwood, what you pass are these amazing, massive ranches. And one of the things you recognize is the miles and miles of fencing that cordons off every ranch. Fences that run for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles. One person's property. And on the way to Brownwood, Texas, on the way to Howard Payne, we passed several towns. My driver let me know, as though I didn't already know, but I was being polite, he let me know that there were a couple of towns we would not pass through because even at this moment, I would not be welcome there. One of those towns, notorious in the history of Sundown Towns, was Comanche, Texas. Comanche, Texas had a long history of keeping black folks out that even runs to this moment. And it also has the distinction, if we want to call it that, of having in its town square still standing, I'm told. I have not seen it with my own eyes, and I don't think I want to see it with my own eyes. It has the distinction of having in its town square a hanging tree. And of course, I do not need to define for you what a hanging tree is. Those two words themselves ought to give you all the definition you need. But let me be clear, I'm not picking on Comanche, Texas, because it is by no means an isolated town. And Sundown Town life is wider and deeper than the historic phenomenon of these purposely segregated spaces. As James Loewen said in his wonderful history of Sundown Towns, one of the only histories we have, his wonderful history of Sundown Towns, he says that Sundown Towns gave rise to sundown suburbs and to forcefully sequestered minority communities, and to the establishment, because of that, of disadvantage, harm, death, all registered geographically. We are the inheritors of this violent geography, sisters and brothers. We live in a violent geography, and the question we must face is whether Christianity in America is sundown Christianity. Sundown Christianity, like a sundown town, is a place that still lives in the violent geographic inertia of segregation. The violent geographic inertia of segregation, and does little to address that history. In order to begin to address that history, we must first understand two of its most powerful drivers. They are the desire for land, and the need to sustain whiteness. First, the desire for land. As I said earlier, segregation is an ancient reality, and so too is land grabbing. But what emerged in the colonial period was a vision of land separated from people. Land and the resources found with land imagined separate from people. And sadly, this modern vision had a Christian architecture. One example of this can be found in the writings of someone I'm very familiar with, Jose de Acosta, Jesuit missionary to Peru in the 1750s. For Acosta, and so many like him, God had given the land and the peoples of the New World to the peoples of what we now call Europe, because God wanted to have the gospel spread to the remote parts of the world. In Acosta, we see the formation of a way of seeing the world as a commodity, a vision of the world in pure commodity form. From him we gain the stark account of a providence of possession in his infamous Hyafia, or ugly daughter analogy. But he also anticipates a theology of extraction, theology of extraction. That is, we may take from the land whatever we wish and use the land to produce whatever we want. We may take from the land whatever we wish and use the land to produce whatever we want. Please have patience with me. I want to quote a nice big chunk from Acosta's thinking. And I quote, he says, "The wisdom of God created metals for medicine and for defense and for adornment and as instruments of men's activities. But above all these uses is the use of its use as money. And although by its nature it is but one thing, actually money is all things. For money represents food and clothing and shelter, mounts to ride on, and everything of which we have need. And so all things obey money. For this invention, that of making one thing serve all things, people choose the most durable and negotiable thing of all, which is metal. And among the metals, they decided that those whose nature was most durable and incorruptible, namely silver and gold, must have primacy in the invention of money. Such is the diversity of metals that the Creator enclosed in the storage places and hollows of the earth, all of them that are useful for human life. Our eternal Lord has enriched the most remote parts of the world, inhabited by the most uncivilized people, and has placed there the greatest number of mines, not mine, M-I-N-D, but M-I-N-E-S, the greatest number of mines that ever existed in order to invite men to seek out and possess those lands, and coincidentally to communicate their religion and the worship of the true God to those who do not know it. Hence we see in the lands of the Indies are the richest mines and wealth, and thus the Lord takes advantage of our desires to serve his sovereign ends. In this regard, here it is. In this regard, a wise man once said that what a man does to marry off an ugly daughter is give her a large dowry. This is what God has done with that rugged land, endowing it with great wealth in mines, so that whoever wished to find it by this means, will do so. Acosta theorized that we can see the hand of providence in the time of Spanish conquest. God had prepared this new land, and in his case, Peru, and its people for intercourse with the Spanish by filling the land with abundances of every kind of metal in order to draw them to the work of possession. Possession of land and people for Christ. Those possessions always go together. Possession of land and people for Christ. This seduction by the divine is inside the more fundamental recognition for Acosta that the material world is first and foremost a resource. The world should be seen in its potential, a potential that humanity has been ordained to draw out. The land of the new world in this vision is filled with metals placed there by God for the continuing cultivation of human civilization. The land, through the extraction of metals, can be turned into money. This is what God has ordained. The land can be turned into money. The vision of the new world in Acosta's theology is one of commodity. The new world is a constellation of inert materials that exist in potential and that should be turned into something else, something useful. Something useful. So Acosta offers us a powerful theological rationale for the logic of global extraction. The logic of global extraction of natural resources of every people's lands. They are the thing God has placed to draw those who are Christian to those places in order to spread the gospel and extract the wealth. Now, he may have wanted to articulate a vision of the land as a means to get to the people, but what emerged was a vision of the land separate from the people. The land was to be possessed and controlled, and the people removed or moved to either support and certainly not interfere with the cultivation of the land, the extraction of natural resources, or the manufacture of production of goods. Now, of course, the issue here is not the movement of people, but the displacement of people as a way of life. What grew out of this horrific way of seeing people and land was a vision that made possession of land far more important than relationship with all those who inhabit the land. Possession is always a far more powerful optic than relationship. Possession of the land, far more important than relationships upon the land. This vision of the land as private property not only turned human energies toward control and exploitation, but would instill in us habits of fragmentation and isolation. We have been, since the early modern colonizing period, trained in anti-relational ways of seeing place, space, bodies, and people. And our Christianity has made little difference to that training. Our minds have been guided and continue to be guided by property boundaries, spatial mapping, geographic designations, traffic patterns, all of which teach us to not see connections. I have two wonderful daughters. My youngest daughter has begun college, which means that someday I'll be an empty nester. My eldest is back living with us, so that's not happened yet. And my youngest daughter decided to go to Towson University in Maryland, right outside Baltimore. Wonderful school. As I like to do when I go places, if I have time, I wanted to get to know the area a little bit. And although I could be there only a short time, I got in the car with my wonderful wife and we drove around some. We got on the main street that the university sits on, which I believe is York Street. Those of you who are from that area know that more precisely. I think it's York Street. And I drove as far as I could from one end of that one street to the other end of that street. I couldn't make it the whole way because it goes many, many miles beyond the amount of time I had. And what I noticed is what all of you notice when you drive almost on every major street in most major American cities. The street ran from big, beautiful, well-maintained homes, a fabulous mall, wonderful shopping areas, nice bohemian places to sit and drink coffee and think great thoughts. all located by the university, all the way down to dilapidated homes, boarded up buildings, and areas with few, if any, stores. That street went from predominantly white neighborhoods to predominantly black and Hispanic neighborhoods. One street. One street. One street connected poverty and wealth. One street showed lives lived in parallel, separate and unequal. And at least one thing seemed to move effortlessly up and down that street through parallel lives. And that was the police. We passed police cars all up and down York Street. And of course, this is not by accident. Place and space for us are always designed. The spatial placement and configuration of land, property, and life, land, property, and life roll out together, shaped by a racial past and dictating a future. Like most of you, I was taught not to see what was in plain sight, that my world was configured by segregated spaces. The church has, for the most part, been oblivious to this reality and oftentimes supportive of it. We have been the high priests of segregated places, segregated spaces, servants to the economic desires that create them. But economic desire alone is not the only driver of our violent geography. You cannot understand this just by economics alone. You cannot understand this just by class preference alone. We live always in the wake of that energy that drives geographic whiteness, with its desire to create communities that normalize white dominance, sustaining geographic whiteness. It's not difficult to believe that there was a time in the U.S. when many people desired all white communities, when sundown towns were the hope of so many. That hope was symbolized in an infamous phrase posted on sign towns and or spoken to African Americans who happened too close to that city. The famous phrase was this. Often it began with the N-word, but I will not have that part. I'll just read the rest. It began in, "Don't let the sun go down and you be in this town." Nice little ring to it, doesn't it? Don't let the sun go down and you be in this town. The consequences of being there after dark were very serious. Violence and sometimes death. And the hope of geographic whiteness grew within the fantasy of white supremacy fueled by U.S. colonialism, both at home and abroad. From the 1890s forward, the idea of a world dominated and controlled by white men gave life to the belief that such control must be registered spatially. It's important to say this to you because someone can instill a desire in space even when they're dead. You listening? A desire can still be active if it is instilled geographically. So no one has to say, I don't want black people around. If you instill it geographically, it is there. It's there. The struggle to control land and spaces and establish geographic whiteness is the untold story of American history. But that history marks almost every square inch of this country. Now, of course, not every town was a sundown town. But what they represented was a much wider reality, and that is the desire to control space. It is not that this country, city after city, town after town, was developed and then enacted racial segregation. Segregation has been a fundamental engine that informed and informs the planning, building, zoning, and organizing of life flows in multiple places. As Kevin Fox Gotham noted in his wonderful study of Kansas City, a great book, Race, Real Estate, and Uneven Development. How's that for a title? Race, Reason, and Undevelopment. Kevin Fox Gotham. As he noted in his book, segregationist tendencies are built into the ways local governments and land developers imagine space, which constantly increases disparities in almost every aspect of society. We're talking about how people imagine space. Before someone sits down and starts to chart out something, before an architect puts her hand to that equipment, before anyone starts to say what should be, we're talking about the way race works in their imagination. We yet live in the geographic history that we did not create. We follow the patterns that have been established, that have established habits of fragmentation and isolation that teach us to be oblivious to what is going on around us. We have normalized the absurdity of grotesque disparity in quality of life, separated by only a few miles or a few yards. But the answer, sisters and brothers, is not a few more mixed neighborhoods. That's not the answer. What is needed is a new way of imagining social life by reimagining geographic life. I think we should do two things, and with this I will conclude so you can ask me many questions. I think we should do two things. First, we need to tell the true story of the space. If I was preaching, I would tell you, turn to your neighbor and say, tell the truth, but I ain't gonna do that. I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna do that. We need to tell the true story of the space. Wherever I go, I encourage churches, and church leaders especially, to learn the history of their space. To learn the history of their space. There are so many churches and church leaders that have no idea what was here before this building. And if you ask them, if you talk to them for a while, they'll ask you, why should I even care? Learn the history of the space. What was here before this church building? Who lived here? Who was moved in order for this church to be built here? But listen, there is a wider story that must be learned, and that is the story of the city or town that we live in. We must learn the history of the racial geography of our city or town. What has been the geographic history of non-white people in this town? Where did they live? Every city has a powerful set of stories. Where I'm from in Grand Rapids, Michigan, all the black folk that came up during the Great Migration all came to the west side of town. That's the only place they could come. They weren't going to let you live anywhere else. And slowly but surely, people began to move out from the west side. Where I was raised, the older black folks, they literally knew everybody black because you were all on the same side of town. So they knew your mama, your uncle, if you act up, so I know you, I'm going to tell your Uncle Gus. Oh, you know my Uncle Gus? Who are you? All on the west side. So we must learn the history of the racial geography of our town. We must learn how geographic whiteness was organized and how the resistance to minority presence was deployed. We need to know this history because the social history of a place is inside the geographic history. More importantly, the roots of most of the problems of any city or town comes back to the geographic history, which shows us the history of the flow of goods and services, of opportunities and disadvantages. If you know the geographic history, you have a better sense of how the money works, how it has always worked. What is crucial here is to learn the truth and tell the truth. We cannot begin to address the racial disparities in this country until we acknowledge and even confess the geographic construction of disparity. We need something like a truth commission in every city and in every town that lays out in as much detail as possible the ways spatial life has come to be shaped in particular communities. We need to know and speak the truth. Name the way it has worked. Secondly, churches and all religious communities should involve themselves in the geographic shaping and reshaping of communities. I'm going to say the word love, I would love to see people of faith start asking questions about the placement of buildings, the formation of neighborhoods, the designation and mapping of spaces, zoning policies, real estate operations, the plans of land developers, all of that. I would love to see churches make as a part of their curriculum study of space, knowledge of space, making sure everybody in the church knows what is in existence, not only around the church, but how the city works. A Christianity that does not understand space denies the incarnation. A Christianity that imagines faith simply floats above the space doesn't understand the resurrection. Space and place are crucial. God became flesh, walked upon the earth. But how many churches know almost nothing about space? How many pastors, if you just ask them basic questions, I'm sorry, I'm fussing now, excuse me. I'm going for my text, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm fussing. I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm fussing. We should invite everyone into discussions about the morality of geographies, asking whether we are perpetuating a violent geography by seemingly benign land development decisions. No land development decision is inconsequential. Immediately, let me just say, I know these matters are very complicated, but the absence of a moral compass in these matters continues to have devastating effects on the lives of so many people. The compass that drives these matters is now controlled by local political economies, calibrated by race, and racial ecologies calibrated by the market. We need to invite people to imagine and build toward new forms of community and habitation that reverses violent geographies and challenges geographic whiteness. We have to challenge geographic whiteness. There was never a day that Sundown Towns officially ended, because in many ways, they have never ended. They represent not merely a historic phenomenon of our past, but a snapshot of the deep sense of displacement and spatial estrangement that characterizes lives in the West, and especially in this country. The question for us is whether we are willing to simply look away or look seriously at racialized space and place, and if we have the courage to do something about it. Thank you. Thank you.